The room was supposed to be a formality, another joint media availability at an international economic forum, another round of carefully worded statements, another chance for both sides to perform diplomacy for the cameras. But what happened in that room, what Mark Carney did to Donald Trump's latest tariff escalation in front of a live global audience, has fundamentally changed the trade war. And not because of raised voices or dramatic walkouts, because of 6 seconds of absolute silence. 6 seconds where no one spoke. Not the journalists trained to fire off questions the moment a sentence ends. Not the diplomats practiced in filling awkward gaps with platitudes. Not the political operatives who have made careers out of never letting a moment hang. 6 seconds where the only sound on the broadcast feed was the mechanical click of camera shutters. A silence so complete, so unexpected, so devastating that everyone watching knew they had just witnessed something that would be quoted, replayed, and analyzed for years. To understand why that silence happened, you have to understand what Trump did 48 hours earlier. The new tariff package was announced on a Tuesday evening. Major trade actions announced with confidence happen Monday mornings when markets are open and the news cycle is fresh. Tuesday evening announcements happen when the White House wants to minimize immediate scrutiny and control the narrative before the backlash begins. This package was different from everything that came before. A blanket 45% tariff on all remaining Canadian imports not already subject to duties. No sector exemptions, no phase and period, no negotiation framework attached. Just a wall of duties applied to every Canadian product crossing the border. Effective in 14 days, the language of the official statement was revealing in ways the White House did not intend. It described the tariffs as a decisive response to Canada's continued refusal to negotiate in good faith. Decisive response. Those two words tell you everything. A decisive response is by definition reactive. It is a response to something someone else did, not an initiative. Previous tariff announcements had been framed as strategic repositioning or corrective measures, language that implied foresight, planning, initiative. This one was framed as a response, and the word continued was doing heavy lifting. Continued refusal to negotiate is an admission that the negotiations have failed, that Canada has said no repeatedly, and that the United States has been unable to change that answer through any means attempted so far. The statement was a confession disguised as a declaration of strength. Market analysts decoded the desperation within hours. One major investment bank described the tariff as an escalation without an exit strategy, the policy equivalent of raising the stakes in a hand you have already lost. Another firm's trade policy team called it the clearest signal yet that the administration's Canada strategy has failed and that the White House is substituting intensity for effectiveness. The markets agreed. Futures dropped sharply before the opening bell the following morning, led by sectors with heavy Canadian supply chain exposure, automotive, construction, energy, and agriculture. But to understand why this tariff reeked of desperation, you have to understand what happened in the weeks before it. Trump did not impose this tariff from a position of strength. He imposed it because every previous tariff had failed to produce the outcome it was designed to produce. And the evidence of that failure was becoming impossible to hide. In the 90 days preceding the new tariff, Canada had signed a comprehensive trade framework with the European Union that redirected tens of billions of dollars in annual Canadian exports away from American markets and toward European buyers. Canada had finalized a critical minerals partnership with Japan and South Korea that gave Asian manufacturers direct access to Canadian lithium, nickel, and cobalt, materials that American EV producers and defense contractors had assumed would flow through American supply chains indefinitely. Canada had completed negotiations on a Pacific agricultural corridor with Australia and New Zealand, creating a Southern Hemisphere supply network entirely independent of American infrastructure. Each of these agreements represented a permanent structural reduction in American leverage over Canada. Every Canadian export that finds a non-American buyer is a Canadian export that cannot be threatened by American tariffs. Every new trade partnership Canada signs is a relationship that does not depend on American goodwill. The diversification strategy was no longer theoretical. It was operational, it was accelerating, and it was producing measurable results that appeared in trade data every single month. American tariffs on Canada were becoming less effective with each passing quarter because there was simply less Canadian trade to tariff. The White House's own internal projections, which leaked 3 weeks before the new tariff announcement, showed that the cumulative impact of American tariffs on Canadian GDP had fallen by more than half as Canadian trade diversified. The tariffs were losing their economic impact while their political cost to the United States remained constant and their cost to American consumers continued to rise. The administration faced a choice that every failing strategy eventually presents: recalibrate or escalate. Recalibration would mean acknowledging that the tariff approach had failed, that Canada had outmaneuvered the United States, that the diversification strategy was working, and that a new approach was needed. Escalation would mean more tariffs, broader scope, higher rates, doubling down on the same strategy in the hope that more intensity would produce results that more time had not. The administration chose escalation not because the evidence supported it, not because the economic models predicted success, because changing course would require admitting failure. And admitting failure was politically more costly than continuing to fail. That is what desperation looks like when it has the power to set trade policy. Not a rational calculation, but an emotional refusal to accept that the strategy has been beaten by someone who saw it coming and built an alternative. And then came the confrontation. The setting mattered as much as the words. It happened at a joint media availability during an international economic forum. Not a bilateral meeting, not a private session, but a public event with cameras from every major international news organization, live feeds running to audiences on 6 continents, and a room full of the most experienced political journalists and economic analysts in the world. The format was supposed to be brief opening statements followed by 2 questions from each country's press corps. The atmosphere was tense but professional. Everyone in the room knew the new tariff had been announced 48 hours earlier. Everyone expected sharp words. Nobody expected what actually happened. The American trade representative spoke first, delivering the administration's talking points with the practiced confidence of someone who had given the same speech many times. American strength, unfair trade practices, the need for Canada to come to the table. The tariff as a tool of leverage. The language was familiar, the framing was familiar. The room listened with the polite attention of professionals who had heard this argument before and were waiting for the part they had not heard. Then Carney spoke, and from the first sentence, everyone in the room knew this was different. He did not start with a counter-argument. He did not start with a defense of Canadian policy. He did not start with economic data. Although the data would come, he started with a question addressed not to the American trade representative, but to the room itself, to the cameras, to the global audience watching the feed. "How many times?" he said, leaning slightly forward, his voice calm and conversational, as though he were asking a genuine question rather than delivering a rhetorical one. "Does a strategy have to fail before we stop calling it a strategy?" The room shifted. Notebooks opened. Cameras tightened their frame. A physical folder, not a tablet, not a screen. "A deliberate choice that conveyed preparation and permanence," he began. The first round was announced as a corrective measure to address the trade imbalance. The trade imbalance increased. The second round was announced as pressure to bring Canada to the negotiating table. Canada did not come to the negotiating table. The third round was announced as a response to Canadian counter-tariffs. The counter-tariffs remained in place and were joined by trade agreements with the European Union. The fourth round was announced as a mechanism to protect American industry. American industry groups responded by filing a record number of exemption requests because the tariffs were raising their costs. The fifth round was announced as a national security measure, NATO allies issued statements questioning whether tariff disputes between allies constitute national security. The sixth round was announced as a final decisive action to resolve the trade dispute. It did not resolve the trade dispute. And now we are here at the seventh round, which has been announced as a decisive response. A decisive response that follows a final decisive action that followed six previous decisive actions, none of which produced the stated objective. The room was absolutely still, not the polite stillness of an audience listening to a speech, the charged stillness of a room full of professionals recognizing that an argument was being assembled in real time with a structural precision they could not look away from. Carney continued, his voice never rising, his pace never quickening, each sentence landing like a stone placed on a scale. Each tariff was larger than the one before it. Each tariff covered more products than the one before it. Each tariff imposed higher rates than the one before it, and each tariff produced worse results than the one before it, by every metric the administration itself uses to measure success. The trade deficit is wider. American consumer costs are higher. Canadian trade diversification is accelerated. American leverage is reduced. The correlation is not subtle. It is not debatable. It is arithmetic. He closed the folder, set it on the table, and for the first time looked directly at the American trade representative. Not at the cameras, not at the room, but at the person sitting across the table. I have genuine respect for the difficulty of your position, he said. And the room felt the shift in register from analysis to something more personal, more direct, more final. You have been asked to defend a strategy that your own data shows is failing. You have been asked to impose costs on American businesses and American consumers in service of objectives that 7 rounds of tariffs have not achieved. You have been asked to call this strength, a pause. The silence in the room was already building, the anticipatory silence of people who sense a conclusion approaching and do not want to miss a syllable. But I would ask you to consider an alternative framework, another pause, shorter. Strength doesn't escalate 7 times. Strength doesn't need to. Strength achieves its objective and moves on. What escalates 7 times with increasing scope and increasing rates and decreasing results is not strength. He looked directly into the camera. Every tariff you impose is a confession that the last one didn't work. 13 words, and then the silence. Not the silence of a pause between thoughts. Not the silence of an audience waiting for the next sentence. The silence of a room full of people who had just heard something that could not be argued with, could not be spun, could not be reframed, and could not be taken back. 6 seconds on a live broadcast. 6 seconds of silence is an eternity. Producers reach for buttons. Anchors prepare to fill the gap. Directors look at each other. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound on the broadcast feed was the mechanical click of camera shutters. The photojournalists operating on reflex, capturing the faces in the room because they knew with the instinct of people who have covered thousands of press conferences that this was the frame that would run on every front page tomorrow morning. The American trade representative's face was the photograph, not anger, not defiance, the expression of a person who had just been told something they already knew but had never heard, said aloud in public on camera in 13 words that could not be answered because the only honest answer was agreement. The silence was broken by a journalist who asked in a voice noticeably quieter than the standard press conference register, as though she were reluctant to disturb what had settled over the room. Mr. Prime Minister, is it your position that the tariff strategy has failed? Carney's response was 4 words. It's not my position, it's arithmetic. Within 20 minutes, the clip was everywhere, not the full exchange. The 13 words stripped from context, they were devastating. In context, they were annihilating because the 7-round demolition that preceded them made the conclusion feel not like an opinion, but like a mathematical proof. One major financial newspaper ran it above the fold the next morning with a 1-word headline, confession. A global news network's lead international correspondent called it the most clinically precise dismantling of a trade policy ever delivered on live television. By the end of the day, confession had become the word that every analyst, every commentator, every journalist used to describe not just this tariff, but every tariff that had come before it. Carney had not just reframed one tariff, he had retroactively reframed all seven. Every escalation was now a confession. Every increase in rates was an increase in the volume of the confession. The entire tariff strategy had been linguistically reclassified on live television in 13 words, and no amount of counter messaging could undo it because the reframe was built on a foundation of data that the administration's own numbers confirmed. And then the response arrived. Within hours, the president took to social media, calling Carney weak and desperate, announcing that additional tariffs were being prepared, promising that Canada had not seen anything yet, and that the next round would be the one that brings Canada to its knees. The next round, an eighth tariff, announced in direct response to a confrontation in which Carney had just argued that each new tariff is a confession that the previous one failed. The response was the proof. Carney said, "Escalation is confession." The president responded by escalating. The audience did not need Carney to point out the irony. The irony pointed itself out. Every news organization in the world ran the story the same way. Carr's 13 words followed by the promise of an eighth tariff, followed by the observation that the eighth tariff was itself the eighth confession. The frame was locked, it could not be broken. And every future tariff for the remainder of this trade conflict will be processed through that frame, not as strength, but as confession, not as strategy, but as the absence of strategy, not as a weapon aimed at Canada, but as evidence aimed at the American public that their leader has no plan beyond escalation. Because if the first tariff had worked, there would not have been a second. If the second had worked, there would not have been a third. If any of the 7 tariffs had achieved their stated objective, bringing Canada to the negotiating table, reducing the trade deficit, protecting American industry, resolving the trade dispute, there would be no need for an eighth. The existence of the eighth is proof that the first 7 failed. And the existence of the promise of more after the eighth is proof that the administration knows the eighth will fail too. This is not strategic ambiguity. This is strategic bankruptcy. And the entire world now has a 13-word vocabulary for describing it. The consequences arrived fast. American businesses that had absorbed previous tariff costs through margin compression, supply chain adjustments, and price increases reached the breaking point. A major manufacturing association issued a statement that abandoned all diplomatic hedging, saying that 7 rounds of tariffs have increased members' input costs by an average of 23%, eliminated competitive advantages in 14 product categories, and produced zero improvement in the trade relationship with Canada. The nation's largest business lobbying group, which had maintained careful neutrality through the first 6 rounds, publicly called for an immediate reassessment. Consumer prices accelerated across every sector, with Canadian supply chain exposure. Lumber prices, already elevated from previous tariffs, spiked, adding tens of thousands of dollars to the cost of a new American home. Automotive parts costs rose, and 3 major manufacturers announced production slowdowns at plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee, citing supply chain disruptions that made just-in-time manufacturing impossible under the new tariff structure. Grocery prices continued the upward trajectory that had been building for months, with the Consumer Price Index for food at home posting its largest monthly increase in over a decade. The American consumer was paying for every round of tariffs. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, but in actual dollars on actual receipts for actual products purchased in actual stores. The domestic political fracture followed the economic fracture with the predictable precision of falling dominoes. 3 Republican senators from manufacturing and agricultural states, issued statements within 72 hours of the confrontation that used language no Republican senator had used publicly about the administration's trade policy. One called the tariff strategy economically irrational and politically unsustainable. Another said his state's manufacturing sector was being destroyed, not by Canadian competition, but by American trade policy. A third said his farmers were paying the price for a strategy that was not working, that they knew it, and that they were done waiting for Washington to figure out what they figured out. 3 tariffs ago, Republican governors in border states and manufacturing states began holding joint press conferences, not to attack the president, but to present data from their own states showing the cumulative cost of the tariff strategy on their economies, their workers, and their communities. The donor class delivered the verdict that politicians were still dancing around. Several of the Republican Party's largest donors suspended contributions within a week of the confrontation. The international response completed the isolation. The European Commission's trade commissioner gave a press conference in which she said, with the careful phrasing that European officials use when they are being maximally devastating, that the latest tariff confirms a pattern that European trade strategists have been modeling for months. The progressive replacement of American strategic trade policy with reactive economic nationalism that imposes greater costs on the United States than on its intended targets. Japan's trade minister called the tariff concerning, a word that in Japanese diplomatic vocabulary occupies the space between strong disagreement and alarm. The United Kingdom's Trade Secretary spoke with Carney within 24 hours, and the joint readout mentioned deepening bilateral trade integration diplomatic code for accelerating the replacement of American trade partnerships with Commonwealth alternatives. Dozens of nations signed a joint statement at an emergency session of the World Trade Organization expressing concern about the use of unilateral tariff escalation as a substitute for multilateral trade negotiation. The statement did not name the United States. It did not need to. Canada's position strengthened with each American escalation in a dynamic that had become so predictable it felt almost mechanical. Every American tariff accelerated Canadian diversification. Every round of diversification reduced American leverage. Every reduction in leverage prompted another American tariff. The cycle was self-reinforcing and self-defeating for the United States. Carney's approval ratings reached their highest levels of his tenure. His government announced 3 new trade agreements in the week following the confrontation with Brazil, India, and the ASEAN bloc, collectively representing billions of people and trillions of dollars in GDP. The agreements were not responses to the tariff. They had been negotiated over months, but their announcement in the week after the confrontation was a piece of strategic timing so precise it bordered on theatrical, a demonstration calibrated for maximum visibility. That every American tariff was not just failing to bring Canada to the table, but was actively pushing Canada toward tables that the United States was not seated at and could not access. So here is where we stand. Donald Trump imposed a 7th round of tariffs on Canada, a sweeping indiscriminate blanket duty on all remaining Canadian imports. Announced on a Tuesday evening, framed as a decisive response and recognized by every market analyst, trade expert, and international observer as an act of desperation from an administration that has run out of strategies that work. Mark Carney confronted him at an international economic forum, dismantled the entire 7-round tariff strategy with data the administration's own numbers confirmed, and said 13 words that silenced a room full of the world's sharpest political minds for 6 seconds of broadcast silence that will be studied in communications and negotiation classrooms for decades. Lumber prices are up, automotive costs are up, housing costs are up, grocery bills are climbing, manufacturing is slowing across multiple states. 3 Republican senators have broken with the administration's trade policy in language that reads like career-ending honesty. The nation's largest business lobbying group has issued what amounts to a vote of no confidence. Canada has signed 3 new trade agreements with economies representing billions of people. And the American consumer, the person who was never consulted about this trade war, Never asked whether they wanted to pay higher prices for manufactured goods. Never given a vote on whether tariffs that do not work should be replaced by more tariffs that do not work, is paying the bill every week at every store on every receipt. How many tariffs can a president impose before the pattern becomes undeniable? Before each new tariff is recognized not as strength, but as proof that every previous tariff failed? Can a trade strategy survive when its own architect has to escalate every few weeks just to maintain the illusion that it is working? And the question that should follow every American from the checkout line to the ballot box: when your leader responds to a calm, data driven 13-word dismantling of his entire trade strategy by promising to do more of the same, louder, broader, more expensive, who is winning and who is paying? Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.